June 6, 1944, was meant to be a day of triumph. Allied soldiers from across the world stormed the beaches of Normandy, braving crashing waves, barbed wire, machine gun fire, and relentless artillery. In reality, D-Day was a turning point in World War II, a pivotal moment that marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. But imagine a world where that day had ended in failure. What if the beaches had been lost, the Allied troops decimated, and the carefully planned invasion crushed before it could even begin? The consequences of such a failure would not be limited to a single battle. Entire nations could have fallen under the shadow of fascism for decades. The balance of power in Europe and the world might have shifted irreversibly. What would have happened to the United States, Britain, the Soviet Union, and even neutral countries watching from the sidelines? Would the Nazis have gone on to dominate the continent and reshape the global order? This is a story of a world almost unrecognizable, a world in which a single failed invasion altered the fate of millions and possibly the lives of every person living today. If you want to discover how history could have been rewritten, stay with this story until the end. The divergence begins with a seemingly minor yet catastrophic twist of fate. In our history, meticulous planning, intelligence, and luck combined to make D-Day a success. In this alternate timeline, however, everything goes wrong. The weather is worse than predicted, the tides misjudged, and German fortifications are far stronger than the Allies anticipated. From the outset, the invasion falters. Landing crafts are smashed against the rocks and sand, soldiers drown in the surf, and communication between units collapses. Chaos reigns on every beach from Omaha to Utah. By midday, the Allied troops that survive are forced to retreat. Thousands are killed, many more captured. Supplies meant to sustain the invasion sit idle in England, while German forces recover and push back with a ferocity never seen before in the campaign. The Allied command is stunned. Eisenhower and his generals must accept that their strategy has failed spectacularly. This is not a minor setback. This is a disaster that will echo across every battlefield, every capital, and every home in the Allied nations. The immediate consequence is clear. The invasion has failed, and Europe is at risk of falling fully under Nazi control. But even beyond the battlefield, the ripple effects of this failure will reach the very heart of global politics. The German military, initially on the defensive, is invigorated by the sudden turn of events. Hitler, sensing opportunity, orders reinforcements to strengthen the Atlantic Wall and deploy tanks and artillery to counter any future Allied attempts. The failure of the invasion leaves thousands of Allied soldiers trapped or dead, weakening morale across Britain and America. The Allied command faces an immediate crisis. Plans for subsequent offensives are scrapped. Every operation that had been carefully coordinated now requires reevaluation. Supplies intended for France sit idle in ports across southern England. Naval units that were supposed to provide continuous support are withdrawn to regroup and protect the British Isles from potential German counterattacks. Meanwhile, German forces begin to stabilize the region. Normandy, which in reality became the launching point for the liberation of Europe, is now under firm German control. Towns, roads, and railways are repaired and fortified. The opportunity to gain momentum against the Axis has slipped from Allied hands entirely. Europe has not yet fallen, but the window for liberation is closing fast. The defeat also strains relations among the Allies themselves. British, American, and Canadian leaders clash over blame, strategy, and next steps. The Soviets, advancing from the east, must reconsider their timetable. Without the pressure of a Western front, Hitler can now shift more resources to resist the Soviet advance, turning what was a coordinated two-front pressure into a far more dangerous situation for the Allies. The shockwaves of D-Day's failure extend far beyond the battlefield. In London, Churchill faces mounting pressure from Parliament and the public. Americans, who had been counting on a quick European offensive, begin questioning the war effort. Morale plummets. Political opponents argue that the United States and Britain have overreached, that the war in Europe may be unwinnable without massive changes in strategy, or perhaps even a reevaluation of alliances. Neutral countries across Europe and beyond watch the failure with intense interest. Spain, which had remained officially neutral, strengthens its borders and accelerates negotiations with Germany. Sweden and Switzerland reconsider their economic policies, hedging against potential German expansion. Turkey, a country straddling Europe and the Middle East, begins to question its alignment with the Allies. Meanwhile, Japan, observing the faltering allies in Europe, grows bolder in its own expansion across the Pacific. Without the promise of a strong, victorious Europe, Japan faces less pressure to negotiate or halt aggression. The war in Asia intensifies, and the United States finds itself stretched even thinner, forced to divert resources that could have gone to a renewed European campaign. Hitler seizes the moment with a renewed sense of confidence. The failure of D-Day is not just a military victory, it is a propaganda coup. For the first time in years, German civilians, weary from total war, see a glimmer of hope that their nation might win. The Nazi regime consolidates power internally, cracking down on dissent, while celebrating what they present as the triumph of German ingenuity and superiority. Europe seems, for the moment, under German control. The failure of D-Day drastically alters the timeline of World War II. A second attempt at invasion is considered but repeatedly delayed, each plan doomed by the Germans' reinforced fortifications. The Allies begin to debate alternative strategies. Bombing campaigns intensify, but without boots on the ground, Europe remains under Nazi occupation. The Soviet Union, advancing from the east, finds itself facing a stronger, better prepared enemy. Eastern Europe becomes a brutal battlefield of attrition. Cities are destroyed, infrastructure demolished, and civilians caught in the crossfire endure unimaginable hardship. The Allies' loss at Normandy has transformed what could have been a relatively short campaign into an extended, unpredictable, and far more deadly war. As the war drags on, tensions rise within the Allied nations. American citizens grow weary of endless fighting abroad. Britain, battered and exhausted, struggles to maintain public support. France, waiting for liberation, is left under the harsh control of a resurgent Germany. The failure of a single operation has now altered the entire strategic calculus of the war. The longer the Allies remain on the defensive, the stronger Germany becomes. With the momentum firmly in Hitler's hands, he begins to explore options that could reshape the map of Europe permanently. Occupied territories are reinforced, local collaborators empowered, and resistance movements suppressed more ruthlessly than ever before. The extended control of Nazi Germany over Western Europe has profound cultural consequences. In occupied cities, life becomes a careful balancing act between survival and resistance. Propaganda saturates schools, media, and everyday life. Young people are indoctrinated with Nazi ideology. Art, literature, and music are censored or co-opted to glorify the regime. Resistance movements continue, but their successes are limited and costly. Every act of defiance is met with brutal retaliation. Communities are torn apart by suspicion, collaboration, and fear. Daily life becomes a constant negotiation with an oppressive regime as the population adjusts to survive under a foreign ideology that seeks to erase their culture and freedoms. Innovation and technology also follow a different path. Military research accelerates, but civilian industries stagnate. Advances that in reality led to post-war economic booms are delayed or diverted entirely toward the war effort. Cultural exchange between nations slows dramatically. Ideas, art, and knowledge flow less freely across borders. The world begins to look smaller, more controlled, and more constrained by the shadow of German dominance. Even mundane daily life is affected. Food scarcity, rationing, and strict curfews become standard. Families live in constant fear of arbitrary punishment. Education, once a tool for growth and exploration, is weaponized for indoctrination. The failure of D-Day has created not just a military or political crisis, but a profound societal transformation that touches every corner of daily existence. The post-war world under this timeline is starkly different. With Europe dominated or heavily influenced by Nazi Germany, the Cold War as we know it never occurs. The United States remains a global power, but faces a Europe locked under fascist control, limiting its influence. Global trade is disrupted, and democratic ideals struggle to take root in a continent dominated by totalitarian regimes. Science and technology develop under very different priorities. Research is often militarized or politically controlled. Social progress is delayed. Human rights, civil liberties, and political freedoms that emerged after the real-world defeat of the Nazis are postponed, potentially by decades. The ripple effects are global. Africa, Asia and the Americas all feel indirect consequences. Colonies under European powers face delayed independence. Japan, emboldened by Europe's weakness, dominates Asia more aggressively. The geopolitical balance of the 20th century is fundamentally altered. Nations that would have emerged as leaders in the post war order are now struggling to survive or adapt to a Europe ruled by an unrepentant, aggressive Nazi regime. Europe itself is unrecognizable. Cities bear the scars of extended occupation. Cultural memory is reshaped. Nations that resisted or allied with the Nazis are remembered differently. The consequences of a single failed invasion extend far beyond the battlefield, shaping politics, society, and culture for decades.